Good afternoon. It's Michelle Savage from Xbrl US here again. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have a webinar on mastering new SEC Xbrl requirements for investment management filers. This is session 2 of our 2-part webinar series, and we're very happy to have with us today a group of speakers who have many, many years of experience working with investment management companies and also in Xbrl. Just wanted to run through a couple of logistical points. If you have any problems with any kind of technical issues through the presentation, please send us an email at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. Also, we are offering CPE credit for a program today, and if you have asked to receive CPE, or even if you haven't, but you'd like to, please be sure to respond to the poll questions that we'll take at 2 different points during the session today so that we can get our certificate onto you. We are taking questions through the program, so if you do have a question, please use the Q&A link that you see on your console and just key your question in right there and send it on to us, and we'll be able to respond to those questions. So first, I'm going to turn it over to our host for today's session. It's Joe Luchka. Joe is a director at KPMG, and Joe has many years of experience in Xbrl and in the Xbrl community. And so I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone. Thank you for participating in today's session 2 of our 2-point series for investment management companies. I want to, thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Today we have some great people on here who are going to talk to you about what you can look forward to with regards to Xbrl for investment management companies, specifically for business development companies and closed-end funds. So after I go through kind of a few introductory comments, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Tice. Scott is chairman of the Xbrl's U.S. Domain Steering Committee. We've worked together for many years, and he's going to give you an introduction, an overview to some of the concepts of Xbrl, as many of you may be new to this kind of realm of tagging of financial statements and related disclosures. We then are joined by Gordon Ruckteschel from Toppin Merrill. He is their Vice President Compliance Services. He's going to talk to you a bit about the workflow and the things you need to consider as you incorporate this into your existing financial reporting process, and some of the pitfalls to look out for and some of the opportunities for success. We also have Nikki Ann Berteau from Broadridge Financial Solutions, who is going to talk to you about some of the specific requirements for business development companies and closed-end funds as it relates to these new requirements. We've got some CPE questions. You do need to answer all the questions in order to get credit for this. And if you have any questions, as Michelle said, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A button. If you'd like to type in any questions there, as I receive them, I'll direct them to our hosts and we'll get you answers to those. If for some reason we don't get to it, we'll be able to follow up. As Michelle said, this is the second in our series of 2. The first one was recorded on May 24th and is available on YouTube. Scott, if I could have the next slide. Here you can see the SEC release numbers for what we're going to be talking about today. And this has to do with some new requirements for BDCs and closed-end funds. Operating companies have been following these since 2011. In my role, I've helped a lot of companies implement Xbrl processes and also perform testing procedures to confirm the accuracy of their Xbrl reporting. So for those of us on this call, we've been doing this for many years and are here to give you some of our sage advice as to how to get this right. So by all means, take advantage of our history of getting this right for operating companies to help you through this process. So these new requirements will require the use of Xbrl tagging of certain information in your filings going forwards, namely in registration statements and some periodic filings. So we'll get to that and we'll give you some tips and techniques. The biggest question that we have is on the next slide, and that is, why do we tag data in Xbrl? And this is basically the advancement of availability of our financial reporting information. So structured data formats allow financial information to be consumed at a much faster pace either by software directly, by some automated rules, and simply taking us out of the realm of a PDF world and enabling us to query data more accurately and more quickly. Structured financial statement reportings also improves the clarity and transparency because of much of the metadata that is reported. It is more accurate and more easily understood what is being reported. So you're not trying to interpret what did the reader mean when they said something, and you're more accurately able to understand that data. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn it over to Scott, and Scott is going to give you kind of an overview of the basics of XBRL. Should you care to learn more about XBRL, XBRL US has a variety of webinars that have been recorded and are available and have data on their website that help teach the basics, as well as referring to vendors, including the two that are on today's call. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott. All yours.
Thanks, Joe. Just a little bit about my role and what I do here for XBRL US is basically to reach out and help provide information to the community, to folks that are building taxonomies, people that are preparers, and just to generally promote XBRL as part of our mission. So some of this is going to be brand new to folks here. Others have probably heard it before, and hopefully we won't bore you too much with a 10-minute little thing on what's happening. We covered a number of things in the first slide, our first set of information that we did back in May. And I'm going to review a little bit of that and go into some of the things that will be talked about today in the other presentations that people are going to be making. So let's first start off with what XBRL is. It's Extensible Business Reporting Language. It's been around now for 20 years or so. It basically has smart documents that contain more data than just text and tables. The information is marked up or tagged. XBRL is more than a format. You hear people talk about comma-separated values or Excel or whatever. Those are really formats. They don't really add any intelligence to the data. They merely structure it. XBRL adds intelligence to the data. So there's a meaning. It's a self-described data model. And on top of that, it allows you to have information about what things are based on, the authoritative references. And finally, as Joe had mentioned, it allows documents to be easily analyzed and tested and compared on a repeatable basis. You had a lot of that's been going on for a number of years of people taking HTML documents and parsing them and trying to make sense out of them with various tools. But there's weaknesses with that, and you have to make a lot of assumptions about what the context is for a particular number. So what this basically means is that you have to add additional information to the document. So this is frequently known as tagging or tagged or mapping concepts that are defined within the taxonomy. The first session, we talked about the taxonomy being the structure. So you'll have the US GAAP taxonomy, risk return taxonomy, now CEF, and up and coming VIP. This will impact your workflow, and Gordon will talk about that because you do have to kind of lock the document in at a certain point, which is going to be earlier than just filing it by 5:30 in order to make sure all that tagging is correct. And then you'll also want to do your own review process. The SEC also requires that things be tagged in a particular manner, and Nikki Ann is going to cover some of that. And a lot of that comes out of the Edgar Filer Manual and Regulation ST. So just a quick review on some of the terms. Concepts are the things that are defined in the taxonomy that are part of CEF or GAAP. So those are going to be terms that you're going to want to know. If you've already been doing GAAP, you're well familiar with this type of stuff. The GAAP taxonomy has almost 20,000 concepts. A context defines the date or date range and optional dimensional information. That's the thing that allows you to give depth to tables or build tables. Facts, that's the actual data that you're submitting or disclosing. And that becomes identified by the concept or element within a document, and also the context, that intersection of the date and dimensional information. So we're going to introduce some new terms today: transformations, labels, presentations, calculations, and link bases. And depending on whether or not you're just doing CEF or you're doing CEF and GAAP, you'll either be into this just kind of wading through the pool, or you'll be all the way up to your neck in it, because there's a lot that goes on with GAAP. So start with transformations. Transformations basically creates a bridge between the human readable data that's within your document and the machine readable data. Some examples are cardinal values like 1 million, or maybe the word 3, 3 locations that has to be tagged. Well, that needs to be transformed into a uniform number without commas, without parentheses and things like that for XBRL. Within iXBRL, which is what you're going to be filing, you don't have to worry too much about that, but the transformation has to be correct in order for it to file correctly. Otherwise, that'll cause a problem. So another example would be negative numbers, as we always say in financial printing, 33,971 is in the hole or negative. So that's going to be transferred to a simple minus 33,791. And then you have things, you'll see this on the cover pages with check boxes that'll be false or true. And there's actually a couple, almost a dozen transformations that deal with this. You can either read the checkbox character or just say, this is always true, this is always false. And there's many other transformations for dates and durations and things like that, but you'll get to learn all that as you go along. Another thing is labels. When you're dealing with CEF, I don't think you have much opportunity to change labels, but with GAP you do. Labels are the things that basically define how concepts are used. And there can be different ways that they're used for the same concept. And what that basically defines is a role or roles. For example, most concepts will have a documentation role and also have a default label. So if I go look down at cash and cash equivalents as a concept, I can see the documentation role will have a blurb out of it, probably from the codification. And then there'll also be a default label as to what they would recommend. Now, the SEC under the EFM with that is going to want you to put the same text that you have in your HTML or your official document. Some concepts will have total or negated. Within the taxonomies that the SEC is using, I think there's 23 or thereabouts different types of roles that can be used. And Edgar only allows certain roles. You cannot go off and make your own. Xbrl also requires that the labels match the HTML, as I mentioned before, another EFM requirement. In most cases, your vendor or your software is going to automatically select the labels and you won't really have to worry about it, but it is something to be aware of. And sometimes we've noticed that filers do want to change the label role or the specific labels that are associated with particular facts that are being filed. All the stuff that get put into a standard XBRL viewable area, item as data, is put into a presentation. When you look at the taxonomy and go into an entry point, say, statement of position or cash flows, whatever the case happens to be, or various disclosures, they're all standard presentations, and CEF has standard presentations, so you don't have to worry about it. Risk return does as well. GAP, you're making your own presentations to match up with what's in your particular disclosure. Also, there are calculations, and that defines relationships between various elements that'll eventually end up summing up. It doesn't actually perform any math, it just defines the relationship. For GAP, you're going to have that CF. I don't know if there's ones defined or not, if I go back and look at it, but if they are, they're going to all be predefined. And then the term link base is something you'll hear, and that's basically an XML term, kind of seems to carried over from XML. Basically, your facts, units, concepts are all part of the instance document, but the additional information, like if you have label extensions, when you have calculations or presentations, those are put in files called link bases. And they're named in a particular prescribed manner, and they're also all that's submitted with your filing to the SEC. These files all have special document exhibit numbers 101 and 104, and they'll also have suffixes such as 101.ins for the instance. And then finally, you have a thing called a schema, which actually defines the relationship of your extensions associated with a particular taxonomy that you're submitting. Again, with GAP, that can be rather large. For CEF, it's going to be small. Finally, and you don't file this, but it's good to know about, you have references, and you can have a reference link base that's built into the taxonomy, and it will tell you what's the authority for these things. And you'll see that when you go look at a viewed document in IXBRL, you'll have one of the boxes will actually have the references. So other references, in addition, I actually kind of got ahead of myself there. You've got where can you get data? Well, there's the Taxonomy Preparer's Guide. CEF has one, GAP has one. The Edgar Filer Manual, it's part of Regulation ST. And then it's in Volume 2, Chapter 6. It's a fairly large section of that particular document, and Nikki Ann will be going through some of that. And there are authoritative references as well. So with that, I am going to go ahead and hand this over to Gordon. I just want to let everybody know that when you start this off, if you're just beginning, it's a lot to learn, but you'll pick it up pretty quickly. Most people have no problem with it. And we're here to help you out with this, and your vendor and providers and software folks will also help you out. So Gordon, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. And if you want to stop sharing, I will start sharing my portion. All right. Hello, everyone. And next up, we wanted to talk about some workflow considerations. And this is whether you are a closed-end fund or a business development company. As Scott said, now that you're going to have to be filing in IXBRL, it really does change up the way you need to think about both your registration statements and I'll say potentially your financial reporting as well, because it's going to depend on what category you fall into. So speaking of categories, the final rule breaks down closed-end funds and BDCs into 3 different buckets. And depending on which bucket you are in, it determines, how much leeway you get on your registration statements. But of course, it also determines what you have to do with IXBRL. So first, taking a look at the buckets, there's the well-known seasoned issuer, and this is going to be the highest level. And in order to qualify for that, you need to have at least 700 million in public float. You have to have been around, so you have to be well known. You have to have been filing periodic reports for at least 12 months. And of course, you have to have been filing timely. If you meet all 3 of those, you become what is known as a Wixie, or well-known seasoned issuer. And that gives you a fair amount of leeway when you're doing your registration statements, putting you on par with what operating companies have been able to do for the last 12 years or so. You can do automatic shelf registration statements and the like. The next bucket down from that, if you're not a Wixie, you may be A2 qualified. So you still have to meet the same sort of well-known part in terms of having been around for at least 12 months doing periodic reports. And of course, you have to be timely in those reports, but you have a reduced float. So you're allowed to have a float of it's 75 million, and then you are what is called A2 qualified, which is similar to an S3 qualification on the corporate side. In other words, you're allowed to file a short form registration statement. And finally, if you don't fall into either of those 2 buckets, you're sort of in the catch-all, all other non-A2 qualified bucket. So in other words, you don't have a public float that's at least 75 million, or you're not traded at all, which just completely knocks you out of being able to be either A2 qualified or Wixie. You could also be a new registrant, or if you've been late on a periodic filing, you're not going to qualify. Now, we're going to look at these actually in reverse order because the sort of all other bucket, even though you get the least leeway with your registration statements, you do get a little more flexibility with your IXBRL. So when we look at non-A2 qualified CEFs, and I'll put a caveat in here that for the next few slides, when we're talking about closed-end funds, we are also including BDCs for the most part, and I'll point out if there are differences. And then at the end of this section, we have a couple slides that are specific to BDCs because they have quite a bit more coming out of this final rule when it pertains to XBRL. So looking at the non-A2 qualifieds, keep in mind that the SEC does not require that every instance of your registration statement be Xbrl tagged. So we have a registration workflow on the right side here, where you start off with an initial N2. And if you're familiar with the SEC registration process, you're going back and forth with the SEC, potentially 1, 2, 3, or more amendments until you get to the point where the SEC is satisfied that the disclosure that you have is sufficient. And then at that point, you can be declared effective. Now, the difference here with Xbrl is that you will have to tag at least one amendment prior to effectiveness. And generally, it's going to be the amendment, pre-effective amendment right before effectiveness, because at that point, that's where all the information will be known, right? At the beginning, you may not know what the fees and expenses are going to be. And of course, it's difficult to tag a fee or an expense if the number doesn't exist yet. So as you're thinking about that process, do familiarize yourself with the taxonomy. It's not a large taxonomy, certainly compared to what Scott was talking about with GAP, which gets up to around 20,000 elements. The closed-end fund taxonomy is much smaller. Understand what gets tagged, and we discussed that in the first session on May 24th. So you can review there to see which elements of a registration get tagged. And also how to review and approve the tagging. And of course, you'll want to work with your Xbrl provider on that to make sure that the tags are embedded there, to understand what the review process is, and how to make sure that you are happy with it. Because at the end of the day, you as the registrant are the one who's going to be responsible for the end result that gets filed on Edgar. One additional thing to keep in mind for non-A2 qualifieds is if you have a definitive or supplemental filing that you used to make under 497, which would now be under Rule 424B, that will need to be tagged at the time of filing, because of course there is no effectiveness there. It all just happens at once. So if there are taggable elements in a 424B, you will need to tag them at that time. So moving on to A2 qualified. So now you are allowed to do a short form if you're A2 qualified, meaning that you can take some of the information that would be required in your N2 prospectus and incorporate it by reference into your annual reports or your periodic reports. Now we're looking at an NCSR example here for a closed-end fund. If this was a BDC, you would be incorporating into your 10K or 10Q. Because of the fact that you're going to be doing this, what's called forward incorporation by reference, not only will you need to tag one of your N2s prior to effectiveness, but you will also need to Xbrl tag your periodic report. And that's because those elements, instead of being in the registration statement, are now sitting in the periodic report. So this is something you really need to think about in terms of your company and who is working on which documents, because the NCSR, the 10Q, or the 10K may be a different group than would work on the N2. And is that group familiar with what the requirements are? So you want to make sure that they are up to speed. And also, if you are a closed-end fund, keep in mind that you can take advantage of the lag between a print deadline and an Edgar deadline. That 10-day lag is an advantage for you there. And finally, moving on to the Wixie-Qualified closed-end funds. These are the highest level that get the most leeway with registration statements. What that means in practice is it's the opposite for Xbrl. You get the least leeway since you'll be immediately effective with an N2 ASR. You'll have to tag from the beginning, and of course, you'll also still have to tag all the 424s and the NCSRs. And one more element on closed-end funds is 8K filings. Now, this also applies to BDCs. In the proposed rule, closed-end funds, we're going to have to start filing 8Ks mandatorily. That did not make it through to the final rule, whereas BDCs do have to file 8Ks, closed-end funds do not. However, closed-end funds may voluntarily file 8Ks for other reasons. And if they do, then they will need to Xbrl tag the cover page on or after the tagging deadline. Now, for BDCs, this requirement kicks in after your first tagged 10Q. And we'll be talking a lot more about tagging when Nikki gets to her section. And one thing to keep in mind, the deadlines, which were discussed in the first seminar, are August 1st for the A2s and the Wixies, and February 1st for all others. And because it's a little bit nebulous on the date for 8Ks for closed-end funds, because there is no periodic report that would be having to get tagged first. So for BDCs, it's always going to be a 10Q. But it's not so clear with closed-end funds. So I would be prepared, if you are an A2 or Wixie closed-end fund, to have your 8Ks ready to be cover page tagged starting August 1st of this year. And keep in mind that tagging is simple for an 8K, but again, 8Ks, as you know, the turnaround time is very short. Make sure that you're ready to handle that. And also there is the odd situation where if you're a BDC and you have to restate your annual financials on Form 8K, then those would need to be tagged if you were already tagging an Xbrl. And that becomes much more complex for an 8K. And then lastly on 8Ks, there is a special consideration for dual 8K filings. And so in the graphic on the right, we've shown a snippet of the bottom of an 8K cover page where those 4 checkboxes are. Those allow for what's called a dual form type filing. Under Xbrl, unfortunately, that dual system doesn't work so well, and you could still check the box, but you'll actually have to create 2 separate filings. And the reason for that is that those other form types, such as 425 and Def A14A, do not currently allow for XBRL. So they have to be formatted slightly differently than your 8K. And finally, I wanted to close up with a couple of slides just on BDCs because they do really bear the brunt of this final rule in terms of the requirements for XBRL. So not only will business development companies have to do all of the cover page tagging and prospectus tagging that closed-end funds have to do, but they're also subject to the financial statement requirement, which means fully tagging the face financials, the notes to financials, and the schedules in detail. And that complexity of tagging those financials with that 20,000 element US GAAP taxonomy really does bring about significant changes in your workflow for both the quarterly and the annual reports. Keep in mind that just the initial mapping and approval of the tags that make up your financials will take significant time. And we're talking really days to weeks in advance to make sure that that is all set. Additionally, unlike most operating companies, business development companies have the schedule of investments, which presents unique challenges. Some of these can be 10, 20, 50, 100 pages, depending on how large the schedule is. And they have some unique elements in there. And in fact, the FASB is working on a taxonomy update as we speak. And we do expect that there will be a taxonomy update for the closed-end fund taxonomy coming out sometime soon for public review and hopefully ready in the 3rd quarter when BDCs will have to start filing in Xbrl. And finally, on the consideration side, just keep in mind that even though you will start with a 10Q, that will be the first required XBRL filing, to think about your 10K as well, because that mapping will be more comprehensive just by nature of what's required in a 10K. And finally, on the tips, some things that BDCs can think about now, have your iXBRL provider use recent 10Qs and 10Ks to start the mapping process. So as we know, generally, the financials aren't going to change too much from period to period. So even though you're not required to iXBRL tag yet, you can get a jump start by looking at your recent filings and getting those mapped to really help start that process. And then when you are in the reporting period, it makes a lot of sense to provide an early draft so that you can compare the mapping from your prior period. And really the best time to do that is when your line items are pretty close to final. Forget about the numbers because those are not as difficult to work with, but having the line items from your financials close to final is good because that will help with the mapping and the taxonomy. And of course, remember that you're going to have to approve not only the content of your report, but you're going to have to approve the XBRL tags and all of their attributes as well. And that is going to take some significant time. And finally, work with your provider to understand what kinds of changes that you make throughout the process are going to affect XBRL, because some will, some won't, right? Currently, changes in MD&A will not affect iXBRL, but changes in your financials on the cover page, in the schedules will affect XBRL and therefore will add time to the preparation of your filing package. And that concludes the end of the workflow consideration section.
Gordon, hey, thanks a lot. That was fantastic. Before you drop off, I want to build on one of the comments on your last slide there and let people know that XBRL is a different process. And one of the things that I can't stress enough is involving all your internal and external stakeholders in your process and your timeline. XBRL does require certain effort. It does take time to make certain changes depending on what you're changing, the metadata, the tables and such. So making last minute changes at 3:45 before you file at 4 o'clock is simply not possible anymore. And one of the pieces of advice I would give you is plan things out and let other constituents such as the legal department and the C-level executives, let them all know that it's pencils down at X period of time to give you time to finalize that XBRL document and make sure that everything is technically and content-wise correct before you're going to file it. This is, a more complicated process. We want to make sure that everybody has enough time to fulfill their responsibilities and to get it right, and work with your vendor to understand when is pencils down and when they need feedback from you as the client. So that's important. And then, Gordon, if I could ask you, the one question came in through the Q&A. Is XBRL required when an N2 filing is planning to be filed on July 28th and has an effective date on 8/1? And I know you had mentioned the 8/1 date a couple times. So if you've got an answer to that, great. If not, we can get back to the individual after the webinar.
So yeah, I think we can get back afterwards with a definitive answer, but given that the mandate starts 8/1, assuming that the filing was on file prior to that, I would still work with the SEC, work with your examiner, make sure that you're going to be good. But that really is sort of the start date for everything is 8/1. So since the filing would be on file prior to that, as long as you work it out with the SEC, you should be able to make it in under the wire. Great, thanks a lot. If I could ask you to advance it to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to do the CPE. I did want to make one other comment. A copy of this slide deck will be made available, will be sent out by XBRL US after this. So you'll have all these slides and the information and the links on one of the later pages so that you can go to some of the applicable guidance and the requirements and the examples. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Great, thanks very much, Joe. Okay, we're going to start with our first poll question. And again, this is for those of you getting CPE credit. So the question is, which of the following is identified as structured data elements within a document? Is it concepts, facts, or context? And this is a question coming out of Scott Tice's presentation earlier. Okay, we'll take about another 15 seconds. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and close down this poll and bring up our next. All right. Okay, so which of the following best meets the criteria for a Wixie, a well-known seasoned issuer? Is it they must have at least 75 million in public float, they have at least 700 million in public float, or it is non-traded or has a public float under 75 million? Which of these definitions best meets the criteria for a Wixie? Okay, we'll just take about another 20 seconds here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close down the poll, and I'm going to turn it back over to Joe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. For the next part of today's presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Ann, and she's going to walk you through some of the more specific facts and circumstances around tagging your registration statements in Xbrl. Take it away, Nikki.
No audio, Nikki.
Can you hear me okay?
There you
Are we
go.
all set? All right, great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining here today. We have a very informative webinar to help you master the new SEC Xbrl requirements for investment managers, right? My name is Nikki Ann Berteau, and I'm a product analyst at Broadridge Financial Solutions. In this section of the session, I will introduce and familiarize you with essential resources you should frequent as a desk reference and will support you through your continued compliance. Also, it's important to note Xbrl was mandated by the SEC in 2005. So therefore, we have learned and improved significantly over the years. So this is also an opportunity to share with you the specific areas where you should pay particularly close attention. Okay, so first let's begin with your submission document. So the submission document has your document and entity information, also known as the DEI, along with your cover page facts. There are specific identifiers and data points where in your cover page that are required to be tagged. The Edgar Fowler Manual specifies these tagging requirements throughout the below sections I have noted here of section 6 of the EFM volume 2. So you'll see a very extensive list identifying and specifying exactly what should be tagged, right? So let's take a brief look at the section 6.5.55, which is the cover page tagging requirements for the N2. Okay, bear with me one second. Okay, so let's take a look at section section 6.6.55. So that's 252. So here is section 6.5.55 of the EFM. This rule captures the cover page tagging requirements on Form N2. The Form N2 appears in various submission types and requires an extensive number of cover page elements. It's important to familiarize yourself with this specific rule. Okay, let's also take a look at section 6.5.20 and 21. So these rules, they identify specific required context based on a submission type. So here you will see an outline of the required elements, their base type, and example values that should be tagged. It also includes a legend identifying, for example, which facts must be visible and inline or is required but can be hidden, for example. So this is another area for both the CEFs and BDCs to deep dive and familiarize yourself with. Okay, let's jump back to slides. Okay, so now let's take a look at Xbrl in action. In this diagram, I'm highlighting the 978,000 US dollar marketable securities disclosed on the balance sheet as of December 31, 2021. In Xbrl, this fact value must be tagged, and that tag has specific attributes that communicate its meaning. The precision attributes, this identifies the rounding that's applied to the fact value, the accounting standard, the standard label, the accounting concept, the time period applicable to that fact value or context period, and the numeric unit. Tagging this value to its appropriate element provides the computer with readable language, which is your instance document. That's what this line of code will be writing into your instance document, so that consumers of your financial disclosures can efficiently consume and analyze your reporting. So it's very important that you get each and every fact value tagged correctly. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the resources available to you to ensure that you successfully comply with this final rule. First, the CEF Taxonomy Guide. This is an essential resource for both CEFs and BDCs. It provides very specific technical guidance on the application of Xbrl in your disclosures. So let's take a look. Okay, so you can rely heavily on this taxonomy guide. It provides you with a robust tagging guidance, and it specifies parts or items of the N2. So this is authored by the SEC and provides examples of DEI elements, cover page tagging, and a tagging example for each required item section. So for CEF, this is an essential desk reference. But for BDCs, you will have an additional extensive component that we will discuss a little bit later. So you'll see here in the taxonomy guide, you'll see, I'll just kind of go through it here. You have the taxonomy structure, the common dimensions that are applicable to your disclosures, You'll see tagging examples. The cover page DEI elements and cover page tagging samples. So you'll really get a solid, vital single source desk reference for your CEF disclosures. Okay. All right, let's go back. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, BDCs will have an extensive additional component to consider in their tagging. First, with BDCs, you must become familiar with the taxonomy. So this is a screenshot of the Taxonomy Viewer. Essentially, this is your library of elements that you will use to map and tag your disclosures. This is an example of the details that are applicable to this element, liabilities and equity. Here you see the labels identified, which is comprised of the standard label, the documentation or definition, and if applicable, the total label. So below, you'll see the authoritative references, which should be your first order of precedence when you are selecting an element. I'll get into that a little bit more here shortly. Next is the relationships. So here the Taxonomy Viewer identifies how an element is related or interrelated with other elements in the calculation structure. So this is important for you to note, so there's clear understanding which element rolls up into that total element. Also, you'll see the tree locations. This tab allows you to identify where a particular element is disclosed throughout the presentation structure of the taxonomy, the standard FAS, the US GAAP taxonomy, and the calculation structure. So here you can see where an element is disclosed in multiple locations. You'll be able to identify them quite quickly and navigate to them through this interface. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, order of precedence. It is very important when it comes to the element selection process. So this order is specifically outlined in section 6.6 of the EFM. Tag to your must abide by this order. First, the references. That is the important first step. Authoritative references and ensure that they are disclosure. Meaning it is an as of or is it a duration element representing a specific span? Next, you have the data type. Is the fact being tagged a monetary fact or a percentage item, or will need a data type identified as a text block? Then comes the document string. This is the definition. There's very specific language to look out for in your definition, like language including or excluding specific concepts. And lastly is the standard label. All of this is important for you to follow as guidance. You'll notice that as you practice this process over time, you'll notice that it becomes second nature. The order is actually very appropriate and very reliable. So you'll really see that it actually really helps and it makes the element selection process go much more smoother if you actually do follow this process and make this a more innate action. Okay, moving along. Here we have the extension concept. So again, with BDCs, it's important to understand that you can create custom elements when you're using the US GAAP taxonomy. So unique to the CEFs, where extension elements are not permitted to be created outside of domain members, extension elements can be created for the BDCs when they're using US GAAP. So these are custom elements. These are custom elements that do not exist in the published taxonomy. So they're not in the standard taxonomy. Therefore, you have to specify what these elements are, right? These are going to be specific custom elements to your entity and your disclosure. There are specific guidelines to follow when creating these custom elements. The first rule of thumb is to not create a custom element if it exists in the taxonomy. That means you really want to make sure you exhaust your effort in researching and searching for the specific elements in the US GAAP taxonomy. So you also only want to extend if there is a material difference between the standard elements and your disclosure. And then leverage the taxonomy viewer. When creating custom elements, your starting place should be an element that already exists in the taxonomy, but you're going to amend it based on a material difference between the standard element and your disclosures. Okay. Now let's focus on some more of the specifics. So first, we have the decimal attribute. So if you recall in the beginning when I discussed the Xbrl in action, I highlighted precision. So EFM 6.6.32 outlines how the decimal decisions should correspond with your HTML, with your document. So you want to make sure you understand the decimal attributes that are being applied. So this would be the rounding that's being applied to the specific value, right? So you can have INF, which represents an exact monetary value or an exact percentage amount. So maybe it's a maximum of 100%. That would be an INF decimal attribute. You can also round your values to billions and millions. So these are very specific decimal attributes that would be assigned to those facts. Okay, now let's move along to the balance attribute. So the balance attribute is defined as the element's balance type, which can be a debit or credit, or an element can have no balance type. These are assigned to monetary elements in the taxonomy. And it's important to note that the element's balance type may not be the actual balance to this slide. So the actual balance type is determined by combining the signage of the amounts and the balance and the element's balance type. So the taxonomy element is defined as a credit balance in this example, and the sign of the value in your instance document is a positive when this would be a credit. And inversely, for example, if your taxonomy element has a balance type of a credit and the instance document value is a negative, that means that your actual balance type is a debit. So it's important to understand this relationship so that you ultimately understand the actual balance type versus the element's balance type. Okay. Now, it's also important to note that in the taxonomy, elements can be defined as one-way or as two-way elements. One-way concepts almost always have a positive instance value, whereas two-way elements can be either a positive or a negative balance in the instance document. So here, signage depends on the presentation, and the balance will need to be disclosed. So, and the balance that needs to be disclosed. So it's important to understand the difference between the one-way concept and the two-way concept. Okay. Moving on to negated labels. So negated labels, these are used they are applied to facts where you are looking to invert or reverse the sign of the value in the instance document. So this is defined in the EFM under section 6.11.6 and 6.6.30. And this allows you to tag facts presented as negative as positive in the instance document by reversing the signage. So here is an example that you'll see here in action of the negated label in action. You'll see the 22.9.10 that is disclosed as a negative in the HTML, so it's presented as negative, but the fact has a negated label applied. That's the negated terse label that's being applied, and it's presented as a positive fact value in the instance document. So this is that negated label in action. You'll find that this is a very necessary label that you'll always want to keep in the back of your mind for when you're going to need to reverse or inverse the sign. Okay, next we have, I want to make sure that we talk about the inline Xbrl submission as it relates to your transformation. So there are specific available how to handle transformations. So you want to note the inline Xbrl transformation registry. Oh, excuse me here. The inline Xbrl transformation registry. You see specific transformations where additional rules are further defined. And let's just back up. So on this slide here, I want to make sure I highlight also the FASB's taxonomy guide. So similarly to the CEF taxonomy, implementation guides on the application of the US GAAP taxonomy. So here you will find extensive tagging examples and guidance as well as style guides. So these will have a period where they are in a proposed state and available for commentary. So you will find that this becomes a very reliable resource. There's extensive tagging examples. So like the CEF file, that desk taxonomy guide, the FASB taxonomy implementation guides, which represents a much larger set of guidance, is available for you. Okay, so
Hey, Nikki, we lost your sound. Nikki Ann, we lost your sound. There you go.
All right, I'll back up to this slide. So on exhibit EFM 6.3.2 outlines the Xbrl attachments as an EDGAR submission. So I want to make sure to call out this is exhibit 101, and this should be highlighted correctly in your exhibit index. So this kind of specific guidance is found in the SEC staff interpretations and FAQs, which is another essential resource. And it's especially important during the initial compliance period where filers are learning and communicating questions. And here's an example of how the exhibit should be identified. So you'll see on the left where in the exhibit index, you have exhibit 101. It references the inline Xbrl instance document and the schema, the calculation, the definition, and so on and so forth. So you really just want to make sure you identify these correctly by stating that these are inline Xbrl exhibits. Lastly, we have the SEC staff observations. These highlight most of the areas we've actually covered in this presentation. So as I mentioned in the beginning, these were our pain points, and this is where we have learned, and we can now share our lessons to guide you to avoid the same mistakes. So first we have the custom axes tags. This is where filers were creating custom axes elements erroneously. Then we have the custom tag rates. Here are the SEC observed filers who were creating custom elements inappropriately to the point where custom elements represented over 50% of their filing. So you want to make sure, again, you go back to what we talked about earlier, where you do not create custom elements erroneously. You want to exhaust your research of the taxonomy viewer, really make sure you exhaust that effort before you go to creating a custom element. Then we have negative values. This was also observed as a common error where filers correct their instance document as negative values. So we talked about this earlier as well. Negative value, we need to understand where our negative values are in our instance document and understand negated label. So to inverse that value so it does not present itself as negative in the instance document erroneously. And lastly, we have the completeness of tagging. Here, the SEC observed filings that were incomplete and missing tagging for parenthetical values or inferences of 0. So it's very important to ensure during your review, you incorporate a completeness check. So ensure that you really do cover all of your fact values and you apply them or tag them correctly. All of these areas are very important areas to pay close attention to. These are the areas we've covered today in this session. So you want to familiarize yourself with these authoritative resources. So remember, the slide deck will be available to you for download. I've incorporated all of the links so you can easily, refer back to them and, use them as your guideline, as your desk reference. This will be an essential resource that will guide you through a successful compliance. Okay, and with that, I thank you for your time today, and I wish you a smooth, successful compliance with this final rule.
Nikki Ann, thank you very much for all that information. That was really helpful, and I think the slides are going to be really good for our participants here. I do understand that we're like a couple minutes after 4. If people need to drop off, we understand this is available for replay on YouTube. If you want to stick around for just a couple more minutes to do the last 2 polling questions to get your CPE, we hope that you can do so. Nikki Ann, if you could just advance the slide one more, I'm going to ask Michelle to come back on and to do the CPE questions, and then I'll wrap up with 30 seconds and let you guys get back to your day.
Joe, thanks for. I'm going to bring up the next poll question. And again, please take a couple minutes to answer this. Which of the following is not an SEC staff observation? Is it the most common error that filers make is to incorrectly enter an amount with a negative value? Is it review your custom tag usage at every filing, ensure you do not increase custom tag rate to above 70%? Or is it ensure you review for completeness, parenthetical amounts, numerical amounts, written as text, inference of 0 values, etc.? Which of these 3 statements is not an SEC staff observation? Okay, we'll give it about another 20 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close that poll down, and we have one more poll question. Bear with me a second here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is the last question. Which statement best defines a two-way concept? Should almost always have a positive instance value, can have a positive or negative instance value, or should almost always have a negative instance value? Which of those responses best fits a two-way concept? And we'll take about another 30 seconds. Okay, just like another 10 seconds here. And I'm going to be turning it back over to Joe. Great. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and turn it back to you, Joe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. Listen, thanks, kudos to everybody who participated today and to you in your process for going through Xbrl for BDCs and closed-end funds. We did have 3 people that submitted questions in the Q&A. Because we're over the limit, we didn't get to those, but we will get back to the 3 of you with an answer. So bear in mind, we're not dropping you on this. As Michelle mentioned, and as I mentioned also, we will be sending out the slide deck and a link that's available for replay on YouTube. I encourage you, as you go through this process, please, start early, work timely with your vendors who are going to be helping you, be open and communicate as to expectations and timelines, and we'll all get through this successfully together. With that, I wish you a good day. And on behalf of Xbrl US and all 3 of our presenters today, Scott, Gordon, and Nikki Ann, thank you and good luck to all of you.